So when a life is taken, the law has to draw this incredibly fine line. Was it a tragic act of culpable homicide, or was it the far more severe crime of murder? The difference can literally mean decades in prison. Today, we're going to break down exactly how India's new Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita makes that critical distinction.
Okay, so let's start with this. A person is dead. Now, your first instinct might be to just label it murder. But the legal system can't just jump to conclusions like that. It has this very specific, very deliberate process for figuring out what really happened. And believe me, the answer is not always what it seems.
To really get to the bottom of this, we need to think like a prosecutor. We're going to follow their playbook, step by step, almost like a funnel of justice that sifts through all the facts to land on exactly the right charge.
And here is that logical path they take. First things first, is the person actually dead? I know, it sounds obvious, but legally, it has to be proven. Second, and this is crucial, did the accused action directly cause the death? You've got to connect the dots. It's only after those two things are established that we start digging into the mind of the accused. We start with the baseline, which is culpable homicide. Then we see if we need to escalate it to murder. And finally, we check if any special circumstances might change the whole equation.
So let's start with that foundation, culpable homicide. The best way to think about this is as the big default category for almost any unlawful killing where a person can be held responsible for what they did.
So here's the core idea, right? You've committed culpable homicide if you actually intended to cause death, or, and this part is so important, if you simply knew your action was likely to cause death. You might not have wanted it to happen, but you knew it was a real foreseeable possibility. That's the legal starting point for everything else.
Okay, so how do we get from there to the much more serious charge of murder? Well, it all happens when the mental element, what lawyers call the mens rea, or the guilty mind, gets way more severe. It's all about the degree of certainty.
And this comparison right here, this gets to the absolute heart of the matter. For culpable homicide, death is just a likely outcome. But for it to be murder, the certainty shoots way up. Death becomes an almost guaranteed result of the action. The examples make it crystal clear. Pushing someone who can't swim into a deep pool could kill them, but a point-blank shot to the head will kill them. That tiny shift in language from likely to certain is the massive legal canyon between the two charges.
Now, the law also has this really interesting special category of murder for acts of just pure depraved recklessness. This is for when someone might not even have a specific victim in mind, but what they do is so incredibly dangerous that it shows they just have a complete and total disregard for human life.
And this example is just perfect. The person who lets a cobra loose in a crowded room could try to argue, hey, I didn't intend to kill any specific person. But the law comes back and says, look, the act itself is so lethal, so obviously going to kill someone that the intent to kill is implied. You don't need a specific target when your actions are that outrageous.
But wait, because the law gets even more nuanced. Even an act that is incredibly dangerous, like the ones we've been talking about, isn't automatically murder. It often boils down to one final critical question. Was there a valid excuse for taking such a huge risk?
This table shows just how powerful context is. Now, these are all real court cases. In all three, a woman jumps to her death with her child, an act where death is almost a certainty. But just look at the verdicts. In the first case, she's escaping armed robbers. In the third, she's fleeing a physically abusive husband who is charging at her. The law sees these as valid, desperate excuses. But in the second case, the act follows a simple verbal argument. No excuse. The exact same action leads to completely different legal outcomes, all because of the why.
Now, even when an act looks like a clear-cut case of murder, the law still isn't finished. It actually provides these specific off-ramps. These are legal exceptions that can downgrade the charge right back to culpable homicide because the system recognizes that, human behavior is messy and complicated.
And these are the main legal off-ramps. They cover situations like completely losing your self-control after being severely provoked, or acting in the heat of passion during a sudden fight. It even covers a public servant who goes too far while trying to do their duty. The law is essentially saying, look, these things don't excuse the killing, but they do reduce the level of moral blame for murder down to culpable homicide.
The most famous of these exceptions is grave and sudden provocation. And listen, both of those words, grave and sudden, are absolutely crucial. The provocation has to be incredibly serious, and your reaction has to be immediate. There can be no time to think. And the famous K.M. Nanavati case is the textbook example of how this plays out in the real world.
Okay, this timeline is everything. It shows exactly why Navavati's defense fell apart. He finds out about his wife's affair in the afternoon. But he doesn't just snap. Instead, he calmly drops his family at the movies, goes to his naval base to get a loaded gun, and then goes to confront the man. The court looked at that gap in time and called it a cooling-off period. His actions showed planning, not a sudden uncontrollable rage, and because it wasn't sudden, the exception couldn't apply. It was murder.
So far, pretty much everything we've talked about involves some form of intent or knowledge. But what about deaths that are caused by just pure carelessness? Well, the law has a place for those too, and it makes a really important distinction between different kinds of recklessness.
Okay, so here's the key difference. A rash act is when you are fully aware that you're taking a dangerous risk, and you just do it anyway, like putting up a live high-voltage fence. A negligent act is different. That's when you fail to be careful when you have a duty to be, like speeding through a residential neighborhood. Both are criminal, but they come from two totally different states of mind. One is about consciously taking a dangerous gamble, the other is about failing to be careful enough.
So after we've gone through all these different legal boxes and categories, what's the one single thread that connects all of them? It's this constant, relentless focus on what was going through the accused person's mind at the exact moment the act happened.
At the end of the day, the law is trying to do something that is just incredibly difficult. It's trying to get inside someone's head and figure out what they were actually thinking. And the difference between a few years in prison and a life sentence can literally come down to proving not just what a person did, but what they intended to do.
And that really brings us to our final thought. The entire complex system of justice for unlawful killing is built on this one profound, almost impossible challenge: trying to judge intent. It forces us to look past the physical act and deep into the complicated and often murky world of the human mind.